Why San Quentin Prison still executes inmates in California. In the quiet just before dawn, when the fog hangs heavy over the San Francisco Bay, a fortress of stone and steel stands motionless along the shoreline. Inside, more than a century of punishment lingers in the walls. This is San Quentin, California's oldest prison. A place where generations have lived, and where some have waited for death. California has not carried out an execution in years. The governor declared a moratorium. The execution chamber sits unused. Yet inside San Quentin, men still wake up on death row. Why does this prison still house condemned inmates when the state says executions are on hold? Why does a system suspended in practice continue to operate in principle? And what does it mean to live every day in a place built for an ending that may never come? What happens behind those walls is more complicated than most people realize. San Quentin opened in 1852, making it the oldest prison in California. It was built during the Gold Rush era, when the state was growing fast and crime was growing with it. The location was strategic, isolated by water on 3 sides, close enough to San Francisco to transport inmates easily. Over time, San Quentin became more than a prison. It became a symbol. The gas chamber was installed in 1937. Later, lethal injection was introduced. Every execution in California since the 1930s has taken place here. The chamber itself is hidden inside the prison's adjustment center. It is clinical and stark. A room designed not for chaos, but for procedure. A final ritual of the state. Even now, despite the moratorium declared in 2019 by Governor Gavin Newsom, that chamber remains intact. The equipment is still there. The legal framework still exists. The death sentences have not been overturned. And that is the first truth many people misunderstand. The execution stopped. The sentences did not. Death row at San Quentin is housed primarily in East Block, an aging structure built in 1927. The building rises 5 tiers high. The cells are small, about 4 feet wide and 9 feet long. Just enough space for a bunk, a toilet, a small desk bolted to the wall. Condemned inmates wake at the same time each morning. Breakfast is passed through a slot in the door. Movement is controlled. Yard time is limited and segregated. Conversations travel through steel and concrete. But here is what sets death row apart. The waiting. Unlike inmates serving life sentences in general population, men on death row live in a state of legal suspension. Appeals can stretch decades. Automatic reviews, habeas petitions, federal challenges. Some die of natural causes before their appeals are exhausted. The average time between sentencing and execution in California, when executions were active, was over 20 years. Imagine living in a cell barely larger than a closet for 2 decades, knowing your sentence is death, but not knowing if the state will ever carry it out. That uncertainty shapes everything. Power inside death row operates differently than in general population. Correctional officers maintain strict control. Movement is escorted. Showers are scheduled. Every interaction is documented. But among inmates, a hierarchy still exists. On most prison yards in America, racial groups organize for protection. Alliances are formed along race, geography, gang affiliation. On death row, those divisions remain, but the dynamic shifts. There are no long-term ambitions. No parole hearings to prepare for. No realistic path back into society. Survival becomes psychological. Some inmates isolate completely. Others write letters, file motions, study law. A few become jailhouse lawyers, helping others navigate appeals. Knowledge becomes currency. Access to legal information can mean the difference between life and death, at least on paper. But here's what few outside understand. Even with executions paused, the mental weight of the sentence does not lift. Because moratorium is not abolition. And politics can change. In March 2019, Governor Gavin Newsom announced a moratorium on executions in California. He cited concerns about fairness, cost, racial disparities, and the risk of wrongful convictions. The order halted executions during his time in office. It also closed the execution chamber. But it did not commute existing death sentences. It did not dismantle death row. It did not remove the possibility that a future governor could reinstate executions. That decision left California in a strange legal position. More than 600 inmates remained on death row, the largest death row population in the United States at the time. The machinery was paused, not dismantled. Which raises a question. If the state does not plan to execute these men, why keep them under the strictest conditions? The answer involves politics, law, and something deeper, public memory. Some of the most notorious criminals in California history have been sentenced to death at San Quentin. Serial killers. Child murderers. Gang leaders responsible for multiple homicides. The death sentence carries symbolic weight. For victims' families, it can represent acknowledgement of irreversible harm. For prosecutors, it signals the most severe condemnation the state can deliver. Removing death sentences entirely would require legislative action or statewide voter approval. California voters have rejected attempts to abolish the death penalty in past referendums. So the system remains suspended between two realities. Executions are not happening. But the legal authority to execute still exists. And inside East Block, men continue to live under that sentence. Daily life on death row follows rigid patterns. Lights on early. Breakfast tray through the slot. Count procedures multiple times a day. Inmates are allowed limited property, legal paperwork, some books, writing materials. Televisions are permitted, purchased through approved channels. Contact visits are rare and heavily monitored. For many, mail becomes lifeline. Some develop relationships with pen pals. Others reconnect with family. A few withdraw entirely. Disciplinary infractions still happen. Fights. Contraband. Disrespect toward staff. Punishments include loss of privileges, restricted yard access, or time in solitary confinement within the adjustment center. And solitary inside death row is a different kind of isolation. Because you are already in the most restrictive housing unit in the state. What happens to a person psychologically after years in that environment? That answer is complicated and uncomfortable. Some inmates adapt by creating routine. Exercise in the cell. Push-ups, sit-ups, pacing back and forth. Reading law books. Watching news cycles change year after year. Others deteriorate. Mental health issues are common. Depression. Anxiety. Paranoia. Suicide attempts. California courts have faced repeated challenges over conditions on death row, particularly around mental health care and prolonged isolation. But here is where it becomes even more complicated. In recent years, California began transferring some death row inmates into general population facilities under a new policy aimed at reducing isolation. The idea was to integrate condemned inmates with those serving life sentences without parole. For decades, death row meant total separation. Now, that barrier is shifting. What does that do to prison power structures? What happens when a man sentenced to die walks the same yard as someone serving life? Inside prison culture, status matters. Historically, death row inmates were segregated partly for security, partly for tradition. They were seen as too dangerous, too high profile, or too legally complex to mix. But when integration began, it forced adjustments. Some general population inmates viewed condemned men as volatile. Others saw them as experienced, even influential. Gangs had to recalibrate alliances. Officers had to modify supervision strategies. And families of victims began asking hard questions. If the state is not executing these men, and they are now living under less restrictive conditions, what exactly is their punishment? This tension reflects a broader debate in California. Is the death penalty a real sentence, or a political artifact? The cost of maintaining death row is significantly higher than housing inmates in general population. Specialized legal reviews, additional security measures, decades of appeals. Some analysts estimate that California has spent billions on capital punishment since reinstating it in 1978, while carrying out only a small number of executions. Critics argue that the system is broken. Supporters argue that the sentence itself serves justice, even if rarely carried out. And the inmates wait in between. Waiting changes a person. It also changes the institution. Correctional officers working death row operate under constant scrutiny. Every procedure must align with legal standards. Every use of force is examined. The execution chamber, though unused, is maintained. Because the law still permits it. And that detail, more than anything else, keeps the possibility alive. The chamber is sterile. A padded gurney. Restraints at wrists and ankles. A window separating witnesses from the procedure room. Another room where medical personnel would administer lethal chemicals. California has not executed anyone since 2006 due to legal challenges over lethal injection protocols. But the room remains. For some, it represents unfinished justice. For others, a relic of a system they believe should end. For inmates on death row, it is a reminder that their sentence has not been erased. Only postponed. And that distinction matters. Because if political leadership changes, if courts clear procedural hurdles, the machinery could restart. How do you sleep at night knowing that possibility exists? Appeals define life on death row. Every condemned inmate in California receives automatic review by the California Supreme Court. After that, state habeas corpus petitions. Then federal habeas review. The process can take decades due to limited public defenders qualified for capital cases. Some inmates spend more time studying legal procedure than anything else. Law becomes survival. Mistakes in trial procedure, ineffective counsel, newly discovered evidence, these arguments can delay execution indefinitely. But delays are not freedom. They are extension. And with every passing year, the line between punishment and purgatory blurs. Many condemned inmates grow old inside East Block. Hair turns gray. Health declines. Some require wheelchairs. A few have died of natural causes before their appeals concluded. When that happens, the sentence effectively ends without execution. For victims' families, that outcome can reopen wounds. For opponents of the death penalty, it highlights systemic dysfunction. For correctional staff, it underscores a simple truth: most of these men will never enter the execution chamber. Yet the chamber remains ready. And that contradiction defines San Quentin today. Public opinion in California has shifted over time. Support for the death penalty has declined compared to the 1980s and 1990s. But it has not disappeared. Ballot measures to repeal it have narrowly failed. Others to speed up executions have passed, then faced court challenges. The state stands divided. Inside the prison, that division translates into uncertainty. Will the next governor reinstate executions? Will courts eventually strike down the death penalty entirely? Will voters abolish it in a future election? For the men on death row, these are not abstract political debates. They are personal timelines. And as long as the law remains on the books, San Quentin continues to house them accordingly. So why does San Quentin still execute inmates? The honest answer is this: it doesn't, at least not right now. But it still can. The death sentences are still active. The infrastructure is intact. The legal authority remains. San Quentin functions as the state's designated execution site because California has never fully abandoned capital punishment. It has paused it. And until that pause becomes permanent through law, the prison remains what it has always been: a place prepared to carry out the ultimate sentence. Inside East Block, men wake up each morning under that reality. They eat, they write, they wait. And in the quiet hours of the night, when the fog drifts in from the bay and the prison settles into uneasy silence, the question lingers in every cell: is this pause temporary? Or is it the beginning of the end? The answer has not yet arrived. But San Quentin stands ready either way. At 5 a.m., the first formal count begins. Each inmate stands at the front of his cell. Hands visible. Face forward. The officer walks the tier slowly, checking identification numbers against a printed roster. No conversation. No deviation. Count is sacred inside prison walls. If numbers do not match, the entire facility locks down. On death row, count carries added gravity. Every man in that building is there under a sentence that, legally, ends in execution. The state must account for each of them with precision. After count clears, breakfast trays move down the tier. Oatmeal, powdered eggs, a carton of milk. The slot opens. The tray slides through. The slot closes. For some inmates, this pattern has repeated for 20, 30, even 40 years. And that repetition, more than bars or razor wire, is what slowly reshapes a human mind. But the routine is only the surface. Beneath it, there are tensions most outsiders never see. Communication on death row is controlled but constant. Men talk through bars. They pass notes during yard movement. They shout across tiers when officers are out of earshot. Information moves fast, especially legal news. If a court ruling changes procedural standards, word spreads within hours. If a governor makes a statement about capital punishment, everyone hears about it by evening. Hope, on death row, often arrives in the form of paperwork. But hope can be dangerous. Because when rulings go the other way, when appeals are denied, the emotional crash is sharp. What happens to a man who has spent decades believing his sentence might be overturned, only to watch that possibility disappear? Some withdraw completely. Others grow volatile. A few become philosophical, speaking openly about accountability and fate. And then there are those who never accept the sentence at all. Every death sentence begins in a courtroom. California law requires a separate penalty phase after conviction in capital cases. Jurors must weigh aggravating factors against mitigating ones. The decision must be unanimous. Prosecutors argue the severity of the crime. Defense attorneys present evidence of childhood trauma, mental illness, or diminished capacity. Once the jury recommends death, the judge formalizes it. The words are precise. The defendant is sentenced to death. From that moment, the legal journey begins. But here is what often goes unnoticed. In California, the appeals process is so complex and underfunded that many inmates wait years just to be assigned appellate counsel. During that waiting period, nothing moves. The sentence stands. Time passes. And the man lives in a cell built for someone the state once intended to execute. East Block is old. The plumbing rattles. The walls carry decades of scratches, names, tally marks. Layers of paint conceal older layers beneath. There is no air conditioning. Summers can be stifling. Winters are damp and cold. When the fog rolls in from the bay, moisture settles into the concrete. The air smells metallic. In these conditions, the passage of time feels different. One former correctional officer once described death row as a place where time stretches, but nothing changes. And yet, things are changing, quietly. California has been rethinking incarceration more broadly. Sentencing reforms. Parole expansions. Closure of older prisons. San Quentin itself has begun transitioning toward a rehabilitation-focused model, with plans to transform it into a facility centered on education and reentry programs. But death row complicates that vision. How do you build a prison focused on rehabilitation while housing men sentenced to die? The contradiction is difficult to ignore. For decades, condemned inmates were automatically placed in solitary-style conditions upon arrival. Limited movement. Minimal contact. Courts later ruled that automatic isolation based solely on death sentence status raised constitutional concerns. Gradually, policies shifted. Some condemned inmates are now eligible for work assignments within the prison. A few participate in limited programming. This integration is cautious and controlled. Not all are eligible. Risk assessments are constant. But even small changes alter the psychology of death row. When a man sentenced to die begins tutoring another inmate in basic literacy, the system feels less final. When a condemned inmate works in the prison library, assisting others with research, the line between waiting for execution and serving a life sentence becomes thinner. And that raises another question. If execution is unlikely, why not commute the sentences altogether? Commuting death sentences would require executive action. A governor could reduce them to life without parole. But such a move carries political consequences. For elected officials, capital punishment remains one of the most polarizing issues in American politics. Victims' advocacy groups argue that commuting sentences without their consent disregards years of legal process. Opponents of the death penalty argue that maintaining a system rarely used wastes resources and perpetuates inequities. California has seen multiple cases overturned due to prosecutorial misconduct or faulty forensic evidence. The possibility of wrongful execution has reshaped national debate. And in that debate, San Quentin stands at the center. Because if executions resume, they resume here. Inside the prison, officers are trained to remain neutral. Personal opinions about the death penalty are kept private. Professionalism demands it. Yet working death row carries emotional weight. Some officers have witnessed executions in the past. They describe the procedure as clinical, rehearsed, tightly controlled. There are checklists, timelines, medical confirmations. It is not chaotic. It is deliberate. But deliberate does not mean easy. Even for those enforcing the law, the experience leaves an imprint. Now, with executions paused, younger officers may never witness one at all. Still, they are trained for the possibility. Because policies can change faster than buildings. After final count at night, the tears grow quieter. Televisions hum softly behind bars. Some inmates read under dim light. Others lie awake. For many on death row, nights are the hardest. Silence amplifies memory. Some revisit their crimes in their minds. Others replay court proceedings. A few imagine alternate lives that will never unfold. The uncertainty is constant. If executions never resume, they will die here of old age or illness. If they do resume, their names will eventually move up a list. Either way, San Quentin remains the place where that outcome will be decided. And that reality shapes behavior in subtle ways. Fewer long-term conflicts. Less focus on building criminal enterprises. More emphasis on legal survival. Death row is not the most violent part of San Quentin. In fact, because movement is restricted and tensions are closely monitored, large-scale violence is less common than in some general population yards. But psychological strain is higher. And strain can manifest unpredictably. Each case file tells a story. Some involve brutal, high-profile crimes that shocked entire communities. Others are lesser known but equally devastating to victims' families. The legal paperwork fills boxes. Thousands of pages. Transcripts. Forensic reports. Witness statements. Appeals examine every detail, jury instructions, evidence handling, attorney performance. Years pass between filings. During that time, public attention fades. But inside East Block, the case never truly leaves. It sits on the small desk. It defines the future. And sometimes, new evidence emerges. DNA testing has exonerated inmates nationwide. Though rare in capital cases compared to others, the possibility reinforces arguments against execution. Supporters counter that the appeals system itself prevents wrongful executions. And so the stalemate continues. San Quentin is not just a building. It is a symbol of unresolved tension. A state that has not executed anyone in nearly 2 decades, yet maintains the infrastructure to do so. Hundreds of men sentenced to die, yet likely to age behind bars instead. Victims' families waiting for closure that may never come. Taxpayers funding a system suspended between action and inaction. So why does San Quentin still execute inmates in California? Because legally, it still can. Because voters have not fully repealed capital punishment. Because governors can pause, but only lawmakers and citizens can permanently end. Until that final decision is made, San Quentin remains what it has always been, a place built to carry out the ultimate sentence. And in the dim corridors of East Block, beneath layers of aging concrete and steel, men continue to wake each morning under a sentence that exists in law, if not in practice. The chamber waits. The appeals continue. The debate intensifies. And somewhere between justice and uncertainty, San Quentin stands, prepared for a future no one has definitively chosen. In the end, San Quentin is less about executions and more about indecision. California has not carried out an execution in years. The gurney inside the chamber remains unused. The chemicals are no longer prepared. The final phone calls are not being scheduled. But the sentence of death still exists in court records. Men still wake up in East Block under that judgment. Officers still conduct count. Appeals still move through the courts at a deliberate pace. Victims' families still wait for answers that may never arrive. San Quentin continues to house condemned inmates because the state has paused the act, not erased the authority. It is a system suspended between 2 eras. If lawmakers abolish the death penalty, the chapter closes. If a future administration reinstates executions, the machinery restarts here, inside these same walls. Until then, the prison stands in quiet readiness. Not actively executing. Not fully moving on. Just waiting. And that is the reality of San Quentin today, a place built for finality, now defined by uncertainty. A chamber that may never be used again. A sentence that still carries weight. A state that has yet to decide what justice truly means. Thank you for watching.